Support Narativ's independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative and check out our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe and download. Hey there, everybody. Welcome to Narativ Live. It's been a while since we've done a fully live show. It's good to be with you tonight. Although, quite honestly, I had chills watching today's so-called COVID presidential briefing because what we got, in my mind, sounded so authoritarian. It sounded, the president up there lecturing everyone about what you must do based on my guidelines, like stay home and do all these other things. And then the vice president equally sounding lauding the president and mentioning his name so many times, I thought I was in North Korea. I thought we were listening to dear leader conversations from the president and the vice president. And so it worries me enormously that we are at this stage because I've been warning about this president for 4 years now. I said back then he was a clear and present danger to the Republic, and he is a clear and present danger to the Republic. And it's not like this threat is now far off our shores. This threat is now here. It is on the home front. We are fighting a battle with COVID-19. Sure, it may be a naturally occurring thing, but and I'm not saying it isn't. It quite literally could be a naturally occurring thing, but there's also a huge possibility that what we're looking at is some sort of biowarfare, that there is something going on that just strategically is designed to upend the United States, weaken the United States, and strengthen China. And that is, of course, what we've been seeing over the last few years. We've been able to say over the last few years that, Russia was involved in this, that the Saudis were involved in it, that the UAE was involved in it, parts of Israel were involved in it. Maybe Bibi Netanyahu's leadership has led Israel astray as well. But we haven't been able to say as clearly as we can today that it appears that China has been involved in this all along too. Now, I'm going to be careful with what I say. I'm going to push the boundaries today because I think it's necessary for someone to say these things. But I have no complete proof that China is involved. I have a deep suspicion. I think when you look at who benefits from all of this, it's China. I think when you look at the way this all has played out with Xi and Trump, with their close relationship, but also their cover-up, which I will explore today too, it's easy to see how they might be working together. And maybe it wasn't them who sent the virus out in the first place. Maybe that is naturally occurring. But their reaction seems to have been very much in tandem with each other, designed to help each other completely and totally. And that is why tonight there is no mistake as to why I'm calling this show Red Dawn. It was the topic of that email thread between many of the White House officials about their concerns around COVID-19, and it makes you wonder why. Because what is the Red Dawn on America, if not the leadership of a communist regime from China? This week, New York City passed a very grim milestone, 110,000 confirmed deaths, probably higher by now. I can't even look at those numbers anymore. 10,000 deaths. Can't imagine that. Now, this is all happening in New York City, a country that should be the leader in the world in terms of healthcare, in terms of fighting pandemics, in terms of almost everything. Now, it is one of the leaders of the world because it ranks number 7th in the world for deaths because of COVID-19. Not America, not New York State. New York City is number 7. If it were a country, it would be number 7 at least. It's hard to believe that a month ago, there were no deaths, no cases in New York City, or maybe just a few at that time. We have seen a progression of this disease, which is quite astonishing. A 10% mortality rate. 10% mortality rate? That's the kind of thing that you'd expect in a place with no health care. Not the kind of thing you'd expect, in America, in the capital of America's health system, I'd say. It's distressing to say the least, and partly because I believe I contracted coronavirus that same week, maybe the 6th of March, when I was there. I was the sickest I've ever been. I'd been working there for a few months, reestablishing myself there when I got so sick. Went to the hospital, went to the ER. They tested me, told me that I didn't have the flu because they tested for that. They told me I may have a viral infection, but they couldn't test for coronavirus. They sent me home. They said, rest for a couple of days, literally. Have some Tylenol and call us if you have any problems. Of course, I did have severe problems. It was a week of torture for me. And I finally got healthier after a week of self-isolation because I just thought that was the safer thing to do. And also, partly, it was very hard to get around. Some good friends were able to drop by and help me with some nourishment. But other than that, I thought it was time for me to get out of New York because I felt what was coming. Now, my worst fears have sort of been realized seeing these numbers now, seeing these 10,000 deaths, this 10% rate. That is the kind of thing we all shudder at and we're all desperately sad about for our friends, for our families, for their families, and for the city that we all love ultimately. And why we are now seeing this particular city be victimized, specifically, as I'll point out tonight, is really depressing. So I'm better now. I'm in Toronto. Everything's great from a health perspective, but I am incredibly concerned about what is happening in the United States. So I am volunteering to raise the alarm that this is no ordinary day in America. This is no ordinary day in a pandemic in America. This is a day where we have to be concerned about our democracy and about our rights and about our freedoms and what that means in the context of this new way of leadership that they have. Because they have this crisis, they can tell us how many people we can gather with, where we can gather, that we might die if we gather with too many people or with the wrong people. Just think about where that takes us in a political sphere with elections just a few months away. So this is Red Dawn. So one of the first things I did in discovering what happened to New York City and what happened last week and the first weeks, I'm sorry, you can tell I'm switching my own show. All these guys who are doing their shows from home on MSNBC and everywhere, they don't have to press all these buttons. They just sit in a nice studio and someone else presses all the buttons for them. I'm actually doing it myself, so you occasionally get to see these incredible fluffs. What I was going to show you there is why I decided to look into what really happened in New York, because I felt that there's something, really uneasy about what was going on. And in order to figure it out, I thought the best place to start was to be searching for patient zero and understanding how the disease got to New York in the first place. And this is what I found. Sometime in late February, a 39-year-old Manhattan healthcare worker boarded a plane in Iran with her husband. She was heading home to New York City despite exhibiting symptoms of COVID-19. At the time, Iran was in the grips of a very deadly coronavirus outbreak, 987 cases and a death rate approaching 10%. That's compared to 88 and no deaths in the United States. At the time, a very different Andrew Cuomo tweeted, "There's no reason for undue anxiety." Of course, that was optimistic. On her arrival home, the woman tested positive. The city had its first COVID-19 patient. She was ordered into quarantine. And that is how America got, or at least New York got, its first COVID-19 patient. Or so the story goes. I don't believe that story, and I'll explain why as we go through these new facts that I've discovered about her. We should look at the similarities in the graphic next to me here between Iran and the United States in terms of the number of people who've died. Now, this is a mortality rate based on an earlier number from April 14th, and you can tell 6.2 to 4.2, that number is much higher as it is today. But again, a very concerning number, but certainly not as high as it is today. Who was this woman? Who was this woman who claimed to be, who they claim was patient zero in New York City? We do not know if she was the first person with COVID-19 in New York. She was the first person to test positive in New York, and that's because she was tested at the state-run laboratory. Now, if you remember, there was a period of time where the mayor was on TV all the time begging Donald Trump and the federal authorities to let them start testing locally, because they needed the local testing to get beyond the crisis that they saw coming. And so this woman who came in from Iran, this 39-year-old health worker, she was the first person to be tested at that facility, and she was the first person to be found positive at that facility. Now, what isn't really known, and I was kind of shocked to discover through the New York Times the other day, is that 32 other samples had been sent to the federal labs for testing from New York City. 32 in total. How many do you think came back negative? 32 came back negative. Now, we know, actually, that she wasn't the first person in New York to have COVID-19 because there are many sites out there. One of them is called Next Strain, if you want to go and play around yourself. You can see the evolution of the disease in each location, and it certainly appears like COVID-19 actually preceded this first tested person from Iran. That there were at least the evidence of COVID-19 existing in New York for weeks in advance, maybe since early January. Yet all 32 tests from the city of New York that went to the federal authorities came back negative. That's probably not an accurate test that they were providing in the federal labs. Maybe they weren't even testing at all. It's, maybe worth testing, and I don't have the capability of doing this, but if there are reporters in New York or others who are willing to check this out, last week I spoke with a lot of certainty around what I believed was a 19-day period of time that Donald Trump was more focused on making deals around the virus than he was about saving people from deaths. That has since been verified by reports in various newspapers. The Washington Post and New York Times have all backed up that reporting. This week, I'm suggesting that the cover-up might be a lot longer than that, and it might include the fact that we were not ever given accurate information about who and what was testing positive because of the federal labs, because they were conducting all the tests, and because local authorities, like Mayor de Blasio's authority, were not allowed to do any of their local testing until so late in the game. This woman arrived on February the 29th. Think about how late in the game that is for a municipality like New York to be stepping into this. We must go back and look at those test results, and we must retest them. We must investigate whether there was a cover-up, a very serious cover-up, because there certainly was a cover-up on the national stage when he was telling everyone this would disappear in a couple of days and that it was not serious at all, that it was all under control. And it reminds me that there was also another cover-up that is very, very similar. Take a look at this. Xi is accused, and is verifiably accused, of covering up what was happening in Wuhan for 60 days. Trump, I've said, covered up things for 19 days, but it might appear that he covered it up for longer. Did they both allow the disease to take hold for theater, at least in China, and for control in the United States? I mean, what other earthly reason is there for allowing this thing to take hold in a country like ours? Why would you do something like that? And just to explain a little bit more about what kind of cover-up we're talking about, a great piece from the Sky News, as they were able to talk to one of the reporters from the South Chinese Morning Post. I'm saying their name incorrectly, but you know who I'm talking about. It'll come to me once I've put this up. She investigated the whole thing. She was able to go and get classified documents about what Xi had been covering up, and this is what she found out. Let's take a listen.
Chinese authorities knew of a case of an infected 55-year-old from Hubei province on November 17. That's 6.5 weeks before Chinese Communist Party leaders alerted the World Health Organization. During that time, hundreds were infected.
Before 20th of January, there was cover-up, of course. From the information we saw, in 2019, there were already over 200 cases.
The infamous lockdown of Wuhan then came much too late. The horse had already bolted. The virus surely would have spread beyond the city of 11 million and likely beyond China's borders.
From my research, there was actually 5 million people in the Wuhan area where the centre of the outbreak was that had left in the 2 weeks before the lockdown there. So if you think about those 5 million people, they have gone all around the world and they have just spread the illness.
all around the world, they could spread the illness. Now, he's talking about 5 million people that were in a position to travel with exposure to this virus from Wuhan. And they could have traveled anywhere. They could have traveled into China, and they could have traveled into the rest of the world. And of course, we know many of them did travel into the rest of the world. And we know that because of an unusual source. There was a study done out of Beijing, the Peking University, which still exists under that name, conducted a study of 103 COVID-19 genomes. They were looking to understand exactly how this virus was developing. And you might remember the story because it was big news that they had discovered a second strain of the COVID-19 virus. And there were two, apparently, strains. One that appeared very, very dominant in Wuhan. So these guys published a report in a very noted Nature of Science and was well received. Except there were questions about their conclusions, but the data, the core data inside that report is still believed to be correct. There are two strains, maybe more strains of the virus. And so it's interesting to see how this study can reveal, or what the study can reveal, about the cover-up that Xi had for 60 days in Wuhan. Let me first take you into the study as best I can. I'm not a scientist, but I can hopefully explain to you what they were trying to understand and how they got there, because these guys actually originally studied the origins of the virus as it came out of animals and into humans. So we're talking about a very different kind of study, as they were looking at how it developed outside of the animal chain and in the human sphere alone. SARS apparently originated in a bat before jumping onto one of the world's only mammal species which has scales, the pangolin anteater. And from there, it was on to humans. Researchers at the University of Peking studied 103 samples of COVID-19 patients from around the world. They came to a surprising conclusion. There are two different strains of COVID-19, an S and an L type. The S is a traditional virus like the SARS virus, and the L seems to be a variant of the S type. Researchers describe the L as being more aggressive and originally dominant, and the S as being less aggressive and evolutionarily older. I wonder if that should say the evolutionarily older. I'm not quite sure, but there you go. Again, I'm switching all this by myself, and I'm really sorry about that. I made a big boo-boo there, so hi. It should actually say evolutionarily older, and I apologize for the grammar error. So, let's regain our composure here and think about 103 people who had COVID-19. The genomes of their disease were being studied by these researchers in Peking University. And this diagram next to me sort of shows you a little bit about what they discovered. The S type of genome, they believed, came from the original SARS virus. And the L, they believe, came from the S virus. So it was a child, if you will, of the S virus, evolutionarily younger than the other one. And what they discovered is that, on average, they said the L virus was very potent in its early stages, was able to take over and be dominant over the S virus in terms of its reproduction in the early stages, but that over time it weakened and the S virus sort of came to a much greater strength and evened out the distribution. And in the end, they took an average of all of this, and they said about 66% of all the people that they could find, and they tested their genomes, about 66% were the L type, and about 37% were the S type. Now, that's one way of looking at it, but basically what they did is they took all their averages of people, all their samples from people in Wuhan, in people in China, and in people outside of China, and they averaged the whole thing together, and they came up with this number of 66%. I went into the data specifically because I didn't quite buy that analysis. I went into and dug into I looked at 103 different samples. I don't know how to read these things, but I was able to tell what they thought of each one of these, which one was an L, which one was an S. And they split it up this way. So there were 103, about 100 that landed up being passed into these tests of these genomes that were being looked at. And when they finally split it up, This is the way it came out. So of the 27 genomes from Wuhan, 96 were L types. Almost completely all of them were L types. So this is all the samples out of Wuhan came before January 7th. So when you think about Xi's cover-up, the cover-up continued until January 20th. So all these samples were from deep inside his cover-up. You've got 96% of those samples showing to be one type of unusual L-type COVID-19 virus. That's something I think that needs to be looked at very, very carefully, because we don't know if this virus or this type of virus was more aggressive than the other in terms of the kind of sickness it proved or provided. But it certainly appears to me that if this is where the outbreak began and this is where the outbreak was most deadliest, then we should be looking at this particular L type of virus, because in this particular case, they're saying 96% of that virus was this L type virus. Elsewhere in China, they got about 30 different samples from elsewhere in China, and the numbers looked a little different there. You know, as it turns out, in China, there was only about 58% of the overall sample size was the L type. And then, interestingly enough, when they looked at the foreign samples, you know, that the other countries had submitted into Next Strain, they were able to see that 72% of those foreign samples were the L type. Now, you could average all those out as they did and come up with a number of about 66, or you could say, boy, how is it possible that in Wuhan, where there is so much death and destruction, the worst outbreak in the world at that time, 96% of them are L. Meanwhile, in the rest of China, where we know there was less of an outbreak, much less, 58% were L types, and probably that's a misrepresentation too. Yet somehow for the rest of the world, they get 72% L types. It's very, very fishy, this particular information that we're looking at here, and it deserves a lot of additional study, because we don't know what the L type does, and we don't know whether the L type exists, to what extent it exists in other parts of the world. But I can tell you for 100% sure, if you believe these researchers, that it is here in the United States of America, that it got all the way to the United States of America. And that's because they showed us the genome breakdown. And the one person they were able to identify quite clearly in the report is this woman from Chicago, the woman who arrived in Chicago on January 21st. This is one of the first people identified in the United States to have COVID-19. She's a 63-year-old woman. She came in from Wuhan. This can be verified through the CDC reporting. And she arrived in Chicago, where we know it was later an outbreak. She went into quarantine, so we're not sure that the outbreak came from her. But the researchers seem to think that she was carrying both the S and the L virus together. I don't know how you do that, or maybe there isn't immunity, or maybe they travel together. But somehow, one of our first people to arrive in this country with COVID-19 had a very virulent strain, it appears, a super duper strain that came out of Wuhan, which we now only know from the study was 96% of the total population of genome in that area. Interesting little fact and worth paying attention to. So we'll continue to look at those things, but certainly in my mind, we're beginning to look at a situation where what we've seen and what we've been told about what happened in Wuhan is obviously not the truth. Maybe it came from that wet market, maybe it didn't. We've now heard the Chinese and the Trump administration, you know, sending allegations against each other. You know, there was one person's fault or the other country's fault, that there was a lab that was testing all of this and that somehow it escaped. Maybe that's true. But maybe also this is part of what biowarfare looks like when you're trying to overrun a country. And I'm not trying to scare anyone. I mean, this is terrifying for me, but I'm not trying to make this any more scary than it is. But this must be considered if we're going to ever be able to protect this country, protect the freedoms, and protect the democracy that we love. It's certainly a possibility, I think, that we're in the midst of something very unusual and very, very different. And maybe it requires a very different kind of approach than we've ever been used to before, because we can't congregate anymore. We can't have political meetings of over 15. Everything we do, if you do it over Zoom, is already being monitored by the Chinese. Just think about how difficult it's going to be able to counter this very, very oppressive force that seems to be coming to our shores. So as we continue our look into what Red Dawn might look like, I want to share with you some of the numbers that I've been seeing, which again will make you shudder a little bit, because it's terrifying. It's terrifying to look at some of these numbers. But there's no way you could look at all the numbers that come out of New York City and say that this part of the world, New York City, has undergone something way more extreme, way more deadly than any other part of the world, except for maybe the area of Lombardy in Italy and the area in Spain. And unfortunately for us, this is all verifiable. Like, I can show you. This is the top 10 countries by a mortality rate. Now, the mortality rate is the number of cases divided by the number of deaths. So maybe it's the other way around, but you know what I mean. You get to 10% in New York City. In the United States right now, I think the mortality rate, it looks like it's 4 point something on this particular chart. And you can see this is the top 10. I mean, you might want to look at this top 10 and really study it, because Belgium, Italy, UK, France, Netherlands, Spain, the United States, Iran, China, and Germany. Take out China, because let's say they have a different story, and I'll get to them in a second. Let's take out Iran. Iran is sort of an odd country there, because Iran was obviously cozying up to Obama and is on Trump's enemy list. But look at the rest of that. Look at all those other countries. They're all NATO countries. Now, what's the likelihood that only NATO countries and other enemies of Donald Trump are the ones that are hit so hard? I don't think that's very likely. They're also all very liberal democracies. So if you're trying to establish the dictatorial regime around the world that democracies are terrified of, well, that's one way to do that. It's also a very unfair chart, though, because what we're looking at is something that's based on test cases. At the end of the day, we only know the number of confirmed cases if there's a lot of testing going on. And there's clearly more testing going on in these European countries and in parts of America, like New York. Now, as we mentioned earlier, if you put New York in this list as a country, it would be number 7. It would be right there above Spain. And guess what? It would be all those top 7 countries plus New York City all experienced 10% or more of a mortality rate. So there's something about this particular virus strain that has hit all these countries that seems to elicit a death rate of above 10%. But as I said, this is not a very fair chart. Let's quickly just show you what it looks like with New York on this list, part of the 10% club. Maybe I'm being a little too funny on something that we shouldn't be funny about, but you know what I'm talking about. And I'm not trying to be funny. I'm just making a statement. Finally, let's take a look at what happens in a different metric, because, testing is a big issue. Testing is a big issue. So let's take a look at what it looks like if you look at the death per 100,000 people, the death per capita. And that's really a much more fair standard to look at, because the death per capita is something we can measure across all population groups, and it doesn't rely on just the, I'm hoping I pull up the right one. And it doesn't rely on just the, I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. I can't actually see what's going on because my eyes are so tired, so I can't really tell if that's the right one. I don't believe that's the right one. Let's pull up the test per capita. I think this could be the right one, is it? That's almost the right one. Yeah, this is part of the test per capita. It sort of tells you where we're going. In this particular list, you see the test per capita. And if I'm not mistaken, China is down there at 0.24% per 24 people or deaths per 100,000. That's 0.24 per 100,000. That's not very much. The reason that is, of course, China's not a very small country. It's got a large population. So no matter how deadly it was in Wuhan, and it didn't really distribute itself beyond Wuhan, guess what? It was able to contain itself to just a very tiny fraction of the population in terms of the death rate in China. It sort of makes it look like China's the odd man out in that list. And when you look at the rest of these, there's a bit of reorganization amongst them, but they're all still those same countries. They're still the same countries from NATO, and they're all still liberal democracies. And so, as you look at who might target these groups and who might be their enemy, who might benefit from it, boy, you'd go right to Russia and China and other dictatorial countries. So what else can we tell from this? Let's say we took out the United States. Let's say we looked at just New York City, and we looked at the death per capita rate in New York City. This is a very tough slide for me, because when I worked this out, I couldn't believe it. I was sitting there calculating. I cannot believe this number. It is 115 people per 100,000 people in New York City have passed away. I don't even know what to say about that. And so we are looking at a very sad situation for New York. It's been the most deadliest week in New York history, probably, and continues. The deaths continue. 115 per 100,000 is not a number anyone can look at and feel anything but great sadness for. How does that look when you compare it to all these other countries? Well, it's by far the most deaths in the world. It's the same as Italy, France, and Spain combined. It's more than 100 times the amount of deaths per capita in China. And maybe it's not fair to put New York as a separate country and compare it to all these things, but the facts are the facts. And 115 is what you come to. So I have no doubt as I look at this that New York was the target of a major, major attack. That it was the target of a major attack by an enemy with a very ferocious weapon. And in the movies, they always attack New York. They do that for a reason. New York is the center of a lot of things. It's the center of the world in so many ways. It's also, if you're a Trumpian, it's also the heart of liberalism, right? I mean, that's where the liberal base is. So it strikes me that, we've got a president who was playing very tough with the New York governor. He wasn't looking like he was really interested in supporting him, begrudgingly getting him help when he needed. And so it begins to look to me like this country is so much more divided than we realize. And that we are basically looking at a situation where people in this country are backed by people from outside of this country against their fellow citizens. Some people have called the last 2 weeks, they said, prepare for your Pearl Harbor. This is going to be your 9/11 moment for this generation. And it's nothing like Pearl Harbor or 9/11 because the numbers are so much greater. And it's nothing like Pearl Harbor or 9/11 because we don't have anything to fight back with. In both those cases, our Air Force, our military, everyone was functioning. We had a leader who was going to defend us against something. And in this case, he wasn't present. He was missing. He didn't do the things he should have done to protect America from the onslaught that was coming. He chose not to do it. And for the last 4 years, as I've been writing and sitting here in podcasts talking about what happened to us in 2016, at first it was clear to me it was the Russians. Then we discovered, well, maybe it's Saudi Arabia, maybe it's UAE, maybe even some of the Israeli leadership were part of this. Then we discovered, well, it's also the Americans, some Americans at least, who have decided to join forces with these foreigners to take down our system. And in fact, that turned out to be, unfortunately, true. It seems that part of our country has taken a very, very bad, for them and for us, Faustian bargain. They'll get billions of dollars, they'll get billions of dollars of deals from China. It's interesting that the farmland, the heartland, is the part of the country that isn't affected by this virus because guess what, America? That's what China wants. China has a real problem. It doesn't have a lot of arable land. It has a lot of people it needs to feed. And America has a lot of arable land. And they're thinking, well, here's the farmers, here are the people who are going to feed China. And they're not incorrect. They'll probably will do that. That's why Trump is so boastful about the $250 billion in food orders that are coming. Correct. You're now producing food for China. That is the new work for the American people from Donald Trump. He's promised them aluminium deals from Russia, dollars for food from China. He plies them with liquor and lies at his regular rallies. He insults our intelligence on television all the time. Every night he comes on and he tells us things that are blatant lies. He throws distractions in the air so we can all run around and say, oh, let's talk about whether he's going to do testing. And is it the governor's responsibility or is it not the governor's responsibility? And what does the Constitution say about all of that? When none of it really matters. This guy's in charge and he's going to do things the way he wants to do it. And if we don't like it, China's got his back. Russia's got his back. And that is sort of where the lay of the land is, in my opinion. And it's just an opinion. I don't know. I haven't got any of the smoking guns that you might want me to have tonight, because I just have gotten tired of looking when I know in my heart what my instinct says is that we will, in a few months, in a year, who knows, maybe we'll never find out, but eventually we should find out that they were all in it together. That Xi, Putin, MBS, MBZ, Bibi, Erdogan, they're all in it together because it's a great idea. It's a great idea to start a global pandemic. It's a great idea to do that just so you could become the number one superpower in the world. And it's a fantastic idea to kill thousands and thousands of people so you can start a new pharma sector. You can start producing vaccines and you can start producing testing so you can be more powerful and even more wealthier. Because this is what's basically going on in our world. And I know you're going to say, well, can't prove that, can't prove that. I can sort of prove it. I don't have the documents, I don't have the recordings. But in everyone's gut, in everyone's instincts, we sort of see what's happening. I've shown you today how there was a cover-up in Wuhan and a cover-up by Donald Trump in New York. Why would those two leaders have such a cover-up? Why would they both cover up each other? Does that make any sense to anybody? I didn't report it yet, but I will report it soon. The Chinese were running around the world in January, stockpiling all the world's PPE, all the protective gear that they could get their hands on. They were stockpiling and buying it everywhere. For what reason? They knew this was potentially a pandemic that was going to hit the world. Why did they have to take all the world's supply so we could all be short of it today? None of these things add up to me. When you look at those numbers and you look at the countries that were hit, and you look at why only NATO countries suffered the most, doesn't it tell you something about who's responsible for all of this? It does tell me. There's no ways it's a NATO country that's doing any of that. I mean, who else is there in the world who would do something like that? Nobody else. The Russians, the Chinese. Those are the answers you come up with. So when you look at those numbers, and when you look at the study out of the Peking University, which revealed that in Wuhan there was some sort of virus, an S-type and an L-type. An L-type in particular, there was 96% of the people in Wuhan who got sick with COVID-19. Guess what? They were sickened by that virus that we don't know very much about, but we know it arrived on our shores on January 21st, and it has become part of our COVID-19 story, which is now just the most horrific thing in the entire world. I'm going to leave it at that because I don't like to go past Rachel, because Rachel's one of my favorite things to watch, and I'm sure it's all of yours. I will say I've been a little bit more open tonight than I normally am, and I hope you'll forgive that. I just can't take it anymore. I can't take any more of watching the press conferences and their lies, their threats, the whispery voices, the back and forth, all of that kind of stuff. People are dying in our hospitals every day. Americans are dying and suffering, and they're treating it like a game. And frankly, there's no room for that in my mind anymore. And I'm not quite sure what we do about it, except I will say, turn to your governors for any instructions. Do not turn to the President of the United States and his guidelines. They don't matter. I think we want to be careful and prudent about how we open up. I think we've got to know more about these tests in New York that went to the federal labs and came back negative when we know there were disease, and when we know there were COVID-19 samples in New York City. We need to know the answers to those questions to understand really what's going on in New York City, because there's no ways that only part of the country should be opening up at one time. There's no ways that only the middle part of the country that didn't get impacted gets to open up. Well, why? You didn't get impacted because you were maybe part of this. So maybe you should think about this first. Maybe you should think about how you're going to help everybody get out of this problem together before you sink the coast into some sort of depression while you become China's serfs and make all the food for them for the coming generations. Thanks for watching Narrative Live. You can always, please, because this is all the support I get these days, is support me at patreon.com/narrative. If nothing more, I'll give you my thoughts and the truth about what I think is happening in a world that is fast changing and that requires our action, requires our thoughts, and requires us not to panic, and requires us to be very careful about how we tread into the future. That's our show for tonight. Again, patreon.com/narrative. I appreciate your time. Thanks for watching. And we'll be back in the coming days with even more. You won't believe the stuff I'm finding out. And that'll be next on Narrative Live. Support Narrative's independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative and check out our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe and download.